Hi and welcome back to the Academy of Historical Fencing. So a question that comes up reasonably often, I would say, particularly on the Spadroon group on Facebook, which is a little bit of a plug if you like Spadroons or you don't know what they are, or I don't know, you just fancy the memes because there are plenty of memes about them. Come and join us on the Spadroon group on Facebook because we're all about Spadroons and having a bit of fun. But yeah, this question that comes up quite often is the Spadroon the side sword of the 18th century and 19th century? So before we go into evaluating basically that statement, let's just look at exactly what we're dealing with first, so that anybody that's watching the channel that doesn't or isn't particularly familiar with the terms side sword and spadroon, very quick overview to what they exactly are. So the term side sword is a very, very modern term, and what it basically refers to is an early rapier. So the kind of sword that was in use around about 1500 up to the end of the 16th century, and they look like the cross between a traditional kind of, cruciform arm-in sword, this the sort of standard medieval sword, and the later rapier. Now, rapiers are known for being very, very long and for having very highly developed or complex guards, whereas side swords, because they're a kind of early form of rapier, they tend to have simpler guards. So you'll usually just find they've got these forward rings that allow you to put the index finger over, and some have a knuckle bow like this, and some don't. It's a complete mix. They can be as simple as just having one forward ring and otherwise looking like an old school medieval arm-in sword. But the characteristic of the side sword really is that they're usually a bit longer in the blade length than the old arm-in swords and a little bit more agile, but not always. But yeah, they're usually a little bit larger, and by agile I mean essentially they're a little bit better suited to thrust work, as in they're a bit more agile and nimble at the tip, but not always, because you can find some really beefy side swords. So there's a huge spectrum on these. I mean, they're not pattern regulated swords, it's just that it's the in-between sword between medieval arm-in sword and the full rapier. And as far as how the terminology was used, let's say in Britain in the 16th century, because the term side sword didn't exist, this would have been called a rapier. So the term rapier in the 16th century was applied to any basically Italian or Spanish style sword of this type, which basically means it has forward rings that allow this grip and usually quite a long blade. So they might have called this, for example, a short rapier or just rapier, and then the longer ones that we know from, say, the kind of golden era of the rapier, the 1600 period, the very long, very complex hilt, they might call that the long rapier. But anyway, you could legitimately call this a short rapier or early rapier, but in a modern context we tend to call it a side sword. So there you go, early rapier of a kind. Now, a spadroon is, as we know it, this is the classic 1796 pattern spadroon, a sergeant's version in this case. The spadroon is the cut and thrust sword of the 18th and early 19th century. Now, they were actually coming into use in the 17th century, but they just didn't have the term spadroon yet. They were being called shear-in swords. But approximately this kind of sword was in use from the mid-17th century until the early to mid-19th, and even a little bit more than that if you include things like the US NCO 1840 model sword. But there you go. So this sword was for sergeants and officers, and earlier on actually was for the common soldier to some degree as well. So now let's compare these and actually ask the question, are they much the same thing or not? So for a start, this is an antique and this is not. Unsurprisingly, I don't have a 16th century side sword, antique, but I have lots of 18th century swords. And what are the comparisons we can make immediately? Because this is quite a good replica. This is by Malleus Swords, make really high quality training swords. Well, first of all, this is designed to be a double-edged sword, okay, and this is single-edged. But spadroons can be single or double, and even the single-edged examples can be sharpened in the last few inches off the back of the blade. So in that regard, there's nothing to really compare, because, okay, they usually have a single-edged blade on this, but not always, and a side sword is usually double-edged, and yet you can find single-edged side swords, so essentially a back sword blade on a side sword. So nothing to really compare there, particularly as I said, if it's got a sharpened back, there's nothing to really compare them on. Or contrast them on. Okay, so the really major defining qualities to compare would be blade length and what's going on with this guard here. So side swords, as we know them, typically have blade lengths of, and again, no, this is not a pattern sword, so massive variety, but you're talking about the shortest ones would normally be around the 34-inch blade. That will be fairly short for a side sword. And yeah, you'll still find the odd one a bit shorter, but as a rule, about 34-inch blade length, ranging up to about 38-inch, and sometimes even pushing up to things like 40-inch blades. So let's say an average side sword is about a 36-inch blade, approximately, which is about what this one is. And the spadroon, well, the spadroon in later life was regulated to be 32-inch, and actually most examples that exist before the regulation and during are all around about 32-inch. They drop down to about 31 at the lowest and up to about 33, occasionally pushing to 34, but when they get to about 34, you'd usually call them more a broadsword because they tend to have a bit more mass in them. So yeah, about a 32-inch blade compared to a side sword that is typically more like 36. So that's one key difference already. And then what's going on with this guard here? Well, you've got this guard with these forward loops that allow this spacey finger to wrap over the quillen. The quillen is the straight cross guard there. And this is a form of grip that actually was in use way before they even had forward rings. It's a reason that the rings developed, but you can go back into sort of medieval artwork and see this being done with old sort of crusader swords when they're wearing mail gloves and stuff like that. So this grip was in use for hundreds of years before this sword came into use. And what it really does is it gives you a nice bit of leverage over the sword. It stops it from easily slipping from the hand, and significantly, when you've got a sword that is very long or fairly heavy in the blade or fairly cumbersome, so like a long rapier for example, it allows you to get a lot of dexterity and a lot of grip and a lot of leverage on it. And one of the questions that people always pose to me is why does the spadroon not have these rings? Well, they were already long gone by the time of the spadroon. So small swords did have rings called anlets, but they were purely aesthetic by that point. They were kept for tradition because the old rapiers had them, but they weren't actually used to put the finger through. So yeah, those finger rings were basically gone. I mean, there were a few exceptions to the rule, but basically gone by the time of the spadroon. And in my experience, because I use spadroons and I use side swords and I use long rapiers, in my experience, I found that the finger rings are not at all needed when you've got a sword that has a blade length of about 34-inch or less. Over 34-inch, and again, this is not exact, because there's a bit of variety here depending on the blade mass distribution and stuff like that, and also, of course, the size of the user. So I'm 5'7". Obviously, if you're a 6-footer, that might be slightly different, but let's say averaging, over 34-inch, these rings become really useful to be able to control the blade length. But under 34-inch, and particularly where it's not got a huge amount of mass in the blade, they're just not needed. Although, curiously, the grip looks something similar. So the spadroon is normally gripped with something like a handshake or thumb on the back, whereas when you then hold a side sword, the grip wrapping over the quillen actually doesn't look that different. It can actually end up looking fairly similar. So yeah, the finger rings are not necessary on a sword this short, and particularly with this little mass in the tip, and therefore they're just not needed. Okay, what else have we got? Well, in terms of level of protection, spadroons can have anything from just a knuckle bow to a single loop on the side to double shells, which is very common. They can also have more. They can have additional bars that almost get to the level of a basket hilt, almost. And a side sword can be anything from just a quillen and a loop there, ranging up to like a full swept hilt rapier, as we would call them, which is very complex. And therefore the levels of protection you can find on a side sword and a spadroon are kind of equivalent, because I mean these two offer roughly similar protection, and if you added extra bars to this and you made this a full swept hilt, you'd also end up with roughly equivalent levels of protection. So that then takes us to what are they like in handling? Well, remember again, side sword is not regulated in any way, not pattern sword. So this is a fairly light bladed example, quite a sportive blade if you like. You can find a whole wide range of them. But overall, you're talking a sword like this is usually going to average about 1 kilo to about 1.2 kilos. And a spadroon of this kind is more in the kind of 700 gram range. But remember, it is smaller and the guard is smaller, so it is going to be a bit lighter. Now, what's the handling like comparing a spadroon to a side sword? Again, let's take in sort of very reasonably typical examples of side swords and typical examples of spadroons. I will say they are very similar. So obviously the side sword is that little bit longer, and that wrapped finger around the quillin then allows you to handle that little bit of extra length. But overall, they're incredibly similar. And basically, let's look at their use. So these kind of side swords developed out of arming swords, in large part because there was an increase in use of swords for civilians, because this was used both as a civilian and a military weapon. So it would be a sidearm in war, and also then worn in civilian life. And when you are carrying a sword in daily life, and when armour is decreasing, which it was through the 16th century, a blade that is a bit more agile and a bit longer and better suited to basically quick cuts at distance and point work is much better than a shorter, beefier blade in many ways. And the spadroon was in a period where armour was all but gone, and again, therefore, is quite well suited to what it's being used for. So both of these are intended as cut and thrust, basically, swords. Now, in fact, most swords are designed for cut and thrust, but they usually emphasize one thing over another. So let's say an 18th century sabre is emphasizing the cut very heavily, and most, say, basket hilt broadswords are emphasizing the cut. They tend to have heavier blades that are suited to it, and grips that are quite restricted to not being quite so well suited to thrust work. And you get into the 19th century and sabres tend to then mix it up and try and go in between. But yeah, you tend to end up with a slight focus on one element more than the other, whereas the spadroon and the side sword were very much intended to be a split cut and thrust sword. And obviously when you go with a kind of a 50-50 split, you in itself is a compromise, because every change you make on a sword is a compromise. So when you go for a split cut and thrust sword, you will lose a little bit of cutting capacity, but you'll make it agile and particularly allow it to have a lot of reach. And that's an important point, because the spadroon, so people often look at the spadroon as a fairly short sword, but in its time it wasn't. It's only short when you compare it to basically 19th century swords that followed it. Actually, in the 18th and very early 19th century, the spadroon was, in some regards, a cavalry length. So the light cavalry sabre that everybody thinks of for the British is only a 33-inch blade, and the spadroon is a 32, so quite long, whereas a lot of infantry swords were a good bit shorter. And therefore, let's get down to it. The spadroon is typically a good bit lighter than the side sword, but considering the side sword's length and guard weight, they are roughly in proportion. And therefore, if you actually get them out and swing with them and fight with them, they feel very similar to one another. The level of protection is very similar. The way you grip it, even though you wrap this finger, isn't hugely different. And the way they move in the fight is very similar. And if you want to talk about striking power and things like that, well, again, you've got to compare individual examples, but you will find a lot of similarity between a lot of the agile side swords and spadroons. So, is the spadroon the side sword of the 18th and early 19th century? In many regards, yes. It would be wrong to say that they are the same sword. They absolutely are not the same sword. But there are a huge amount of similarities between the two. So, in many ways, yes. It wouldn't necessarily be helpful to start calling it a side sword, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. But just as a fun comparison to see, how swords evolve, how they change over time. Are these kind of doing the same job in their equivalent time periods? Are they much the same weapon? Yeah, in many ways they really actually are. And that will be quite an interesting eye-opener for some people, because of course over the years the spadroon gets loads of a bad rep, and the side sword gets a lot of love, although that's in many ways even quite a recent thing. So yeah, side sword, spadroon, are they quite similar? In many regards, yes. They are both that kind of medium length, medium hand protection, split cut and thrust blade that emphasizes agility and speed to deliver quick cuts and thrusts. So they absolutely are kind of going along the same ideas and the same sort of concepts of what is important in a fight. And so there are a huge amount of similarities between the two. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. And that does answer the question of, is the spadroon the side sword of the 18th century? Well, yeah, kind of is. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do subscribe, and thanks for watching.